and welcome back to the Brainwave. I'm Brady DeShong, and I'm here with my friend Dr. John Bounce, and one of my favorite professors of all time, Dr. David Bradnick. So Dr. Bradnick, let's introduce you a little bit. You're a professor at HACC, and do you still teach at York?
Yes, I'm also at York College.
Also York College, okay. And just so the people can get to know you a little better, you go into a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. So I have my PhD in systematic theology, and I come from a Christian background. And some of the areas that I have specialized in would be the intersection of science and religion. I also delve into the area of the demonic, and actually I kind of try to bring together religious beliefs, also sociological and psychological views of demon possession and science, and how can we make sense of evil within the world. I have a Master's of Arts from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and that's a Master of Arts in Religion. I also have a Bachelor's in Pastoral Ministry. So when I set off on my academic journey many years ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, at least some of my students think that's when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I thought that I felt a call to ministry, and so I thought that meant pastoral ministry, that I would be preaching at a church, and I did do youth ministry for a period of time, a few years, but whenever I went off to college, I got this idea that, I really like the academic side of studying religion. And in fact, if I didn't have this religious interest, I probably would have told you I would have wanted to go to school to be like a history teacher at a high school.
Yeah.
And so as I am in college, I'm thinking, here's a way for me to blend together my religious interests and also my academic interests, and I could actually teach religion at a college or a university.
Yeah.
And so I ended up finishing my degree in pastoral ministry, but then shifted to my master's in religion, which then led me to a PhD in systematic theology.
Okay.
So it's a little
Awesome.
bit.
Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is cool. What a background. More specifically, it's systematic?
Yes.
What's the explain that?
That's a great question. Yes, a lot of people ask what that means. And another way of thinking about systematic theology is constructive theology, as opposed to, say, biblical theology or historical theology. So, for instance, someone who does historical theology might study the major theologians throughout the history of the church, folks like Augustine, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and basically try to summarize their thought, or maybe try to figure out different angles of understanding these theologians. So that's more of a descriptive type of theology. Or biblical theology is also descriptive. So let's look at, say, the Old Testament and try to figure out what are some overarching themes going on here. Or if I'm going to look at just the Apostle Paul, what's his theology? Whereas systematic theology is constructive in the sense that we are trying to get new perspectives, new ways of looking at anything really from a religious or theological perspective. So I mentioned before that one of my areas of interest is science and religion, or science and theology. So what perspectives can we not only glean from science, but are there any insights that maybe theology can provide to the scientific side of things as well too? And so constructive or systematic theologians, again, the possibilities are endless of what you could look at. You could look at politics in theology, you could look at disability in theology. So how do we understand folks with disabilities from a religious standpoint?
Okay.
For instance, some people would read the Bible and say, there's even a passage in the Bible where Jesus encounters someone with a disability, and the people are like, what sin did their parents commit? And so so often, like within the church, folks with disabilities have been neglected. Churches have been structured around people who can read, who can hear, who can speak, who can walk in the doors of the church.
Right.
And so if, as a Christian, we are to share God's love with everyone, well, then we also need to share it with people with disabilities, and we need to be intentional about sharing it with people with disabilities. But
Gotcha.
that's just a small sampling of some of the things that systematic theologians do.
I'm going to want to get into philosophy after this is over. I'm intrigued.
Well, and this will start you off, Ben.
Okay.
So, you and I spoke, I guess it was back in December, after, was it a final I took? Maybe after I handed in a final paper. That's what it was. Handed in my final paper for you. We spoke a little bit, and you had mentioned that you didn't think that if a God existed, you didn't think there would be a hell. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Did you... Am I recalling?
Yeah,
that
you were coming out with some big questions right away. Like you're not easing into it,
Well,
just jumping in.
I only say that because the Pope was in the headlines. I don't remember, a couple months ago, because apparently he had said that there was no hell, or his words were misconstrued into people thinking that he said that there was no hell.
Yeah, it sounds vaguely familiar. I'm trying to recall from my memory.
Yeah,
what he
I don't
was
mean
saying,
to blast you right from the start, but
no, that's okay. So I can at least speak from my perspective. So I grew up in a very conservative Christian background, and more specifically, I grew up in a Pentecostal church.
Okay.
Which I don't know if I should say anything about Pentecostalism, because that in and of itself could take on a long period, a good chunk of our conversation. But Pentecostals typically are fairly conservative in the sense they typically maintain traditional Christian views in the existence of God, the existence of heaven, the existence of hell. And my personal beliefs is that, I do question the existence of hell. And part of that goes back to my belief that if God is all loving, then how could God not only just create hell, but also condemn people to hell for eternity?
I'm so glad you said it like that, because I was listening to some other science debates not long ago, and one of the big things is saying if God is all good and all loving, then if you sinned, depending on what it was, or a certain amount of times, whatever, that he would condemn you to an eternity of torture, or something along those lines. And this is a really good question I definitely want to ask you. But if God is all good, then how can you define what is good? If there's a tsunami that wipes out some untillioned amount of people, then what part of that was good? So that's my big question. What qualifies good?
Good we can get into later. Okay. Make that transition.
Okay.
So you brought up the issue of hell. Was there something specific that you wanted to probe about? Or was there you want to talk about it in general? Or?
I don't know if there's a specific direction to poke at here, but I know a lot of people really were outraged or confused when this news broke that the Pope had apparently said this, because it's very shocking to a lot of people to hear someone of that religious authority say that.
Yeah, and I think one reason is because this is a traditional Christian belief. And here's where you see modern presuppositions, modern ways of thinking influencing religious beliefs. And for traditional folks to have modern philosophy challenge their religious beliefs, one way of dealing with that is that, well, no, we can't have any philosophy challenge them at all, and so what we need to do is just maintain our religious beliefs. We're not going to compromise at all. And then there are other people within the church who welcome those types of challenges and say, well, if our religious truth is really truth, then it can stand up to any of these challenges. And so you really see within the church, and I'm making some broad brushstrokes here, making some generalizations, where you have more conservative branches of the church who don't want to change, and they are resistant to not only philosophy, but they're also resistant to science as well too. And then you have more progressive branches of the church who would say, let's look for truth anywhere that we can find it. And so religion is one area where we can find truth, but that can be supplemented by looking in the soft sciences, the hard sciences, philosophy, just wherever conversation takes us.
Yeah.
And so I'm more in that progressive branch where, again, I want to explore truth no matter what the source is. And so, going back to the view of hell, if we do have this, all-loving God who's going to condemn us to hell forever, that doesn't sound very loving to me at all. And I can understand maybe God wanting to, for lack of a better term, punish someone, or at least teach them of their lesson. But if you condemn someone to hell for eternity, I mean, there's no lesson to be learned.
Yeah, exactly. You've probably learned 5 years into it. Sucks for you. You got an eternity to go.
Right. There's no other chance. And here's where Western religions are very much different from Eastern religions, where the Eastern religions that do believe in reincarnation, if you don't get it right in this life, that's fine, because you have thousands, millions, an infinite number of lives in order to correct it, get it right. So sometimes you make progress, sometimes you might regress, but in many Western religions, again, traditionally, you have this one life. And you either get it right or you get it wrong, and then for this very short period of time, when you think about the age of the universe, we're talking about like 13.7 billion years old, and we're only on this earth, if some of us are lucky, 100 years, and a lot of us aren't even that lucky. Right. You're talking average lifespan in the U.S., 72 years, something like that.
Yep.
So we're just a speck, and to make us, pay for eternity for something that we've done in that very small speck of time, it just doesn't seem just to me.
Yep.
And I think that, for me, God's not only loving, but God is also just as well too. And an example I often give in my classroom, and you're probably tired of hearing this, I talk about, like, if one of my kids does something wrong at the house, they break one of the rules, and I get upset with them, and I'm like, go to your room, you're grounded, or when they're younger, send them to timeout. In our house, it was the steps, they go sit on the steps for timeout. But I'm like, and they're like, well, how long is my timeout? Eternity. If I actually did that, and my son is like 50 years old and he's still sitting on the steps.
All because he ate that cookie before dinner.
Exactly. The cops are going to be showing up at my house, they're going to put me in cuffs and send me off to prison. But when God traditionally, in a traditional sense, does that, sends us to hell for eternity, or at least in that belief system, people are like, okay with that. Like, God can bend the rules. We don't hold God to the same standard as we hold ourselves. And in a sense, shouldn't we hold God to higher standards than what we hold ourselves to? So for me, it just doesn't make logical sense when you try to hold those two things in tension.
Yeah, that's the same problem I have every time I'm hearing any kind of religious or scientific debate, because every once in a while science will dip into the whole religion aspect of it, and there have just been so many times I've heard God mentioned saying, like, oh, well, now that you're exploring into sciences and we're starting to explain things that some people used to not understand, saying that was an act of God.
Right.
But now we can quantifiably answer that through physics. But then, like, they expand on that, saying, oh, God works in mysterious ways, because they can't justify it to their knowledge, how that's possible scientifically.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that?
No, that's a great question, and you're right. So ancient people didn't have our knowledge of science, and so for many ancient people it was the supernatural, it was God, it was spirits, angels, demons, whatever it was, you know. Even when you think about the rain, they didn't know that was atmospheric forces working to cause it to rain, so they might do their rituals or pray, whatever.
With the
religion.
volcano erupt and they sacrifice the virgin.
Right, exactly. So that's a good example. In fact, I just saw an article, I think it was through NPR, where this either Central American or South American group of people sacrificed like a couple hundred children. Whoa. Because it was raining and it wouldn't stop raining, and so they thought if we sacrifice these children, like, it will stop raining.
When was this?
They just recently found all of these skeletal remains.
Oh, okay.
Not just it wasn't recent. I'm sorry. I should have made that clear. Yeah, this happened hundreds of years ago.
Last month.
But yeah. But yeah, so as science began to develop and more things were explained scientifically, religious explanations, kind of the room for religion began to shrink, and science began to take over that room. And oftentimes it's referred to as the God of the gaps theory.
Yep.
Love that.
And I know that we've had some of these conversations before. And so it's like, well, where science doesn't have the answer, then someone just says, well, it's God. It's religion, or you give the typical Sunday school answer of Jesus. You know, anytime someone asks a question in Sunday school, the right answer is always Jesus, right? Yeah. So the question is, as science begins to progress and learn more and more, then theoretically we would expect religious answers to these questions we humans have, to that space to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So will we ever get to the point where science has answered all of our questions and there is no gap left for religion to provide any of those answers?
Honestly, I would be kind of bummed out if we one day had all the answers, because that's what science is finding out the answers.
You're out of a job.
Yeah, exactly. What do I do?
Well, that was going to be kind of one of my questions for you. I don't know if it goes both ways.
Sure,
if I'm allowed to interview you, but I know that you have a science background, and I was kind of interested on how you would respond to, would science ever fill in all these gaps completely?
I don't think so. As long as science exists and we are discovering things, we will discover something else that we have to discover. So, yeah, we might one day find the answer to dark matter, and you and I were having a conversation about this, where theoretically, I think that dark matter, being the space between all matter that is causing it to expand exponentially just on the large scale of the universe, I think that dark matter, when we actually can discover what that is, then break that down, we might have a whole nother molecular system that we didn't know existed, and then we're going to start working on that even more. And there's the multi-universe theory. So we've discovered what? 0.05% of our own universe, and now we discovered, there's an infinite amount of those. I don't think we'll ever have all the answers. We will certainly work towards that, because it's what we do, but no. Will we ever have all the answers? I doubt it.
Well, and here's where I think some scientists, who are in some ways almost fundamentalists in the way that some religious folks are fundamentalists, like I'm thinking like a Richard Dawkins, probably already expected me to say this.
Christopher Hitchens, maybe?
Yeah, and so you ask Dawkins, like, well, if you bring up the fact that science doesn't have all the answers, he'll often respond, yet. You know, give science enough time and science will come up with all of the answers. And, you know, I would say, even if, let's say that science does come up with all the answers from a scientific standpoint, I think as human beings, we are still going to ask the fundamental questions that humans always ask, things like, why am I here? What is my meaning and purpose in life? Is there anything beyond this? So even if we come up with that physics equation that explains everything, or if we come up with the theory of everything that brings together like the various forces in the universe, like the magnetic and the gravitational, humans are still going to ask that question, well, what does this mean for me? What's my meaning and purpose in life?
Mm-hmm.
Is it all meaningless? Do we come to a state of nihilism where I get to create my own meaning and purpose in life?
Yep.
And so I think part of existing, part of being a human is to ask those questions.
Yeah.
So
and I totally agree. I mean, still, to this day, I know why I'm here, but I don't know what put me here. What extremely fortunate historical events have occurred that I'm sitting here being able to have this conversation with you guys. Like, that's the kind of stuff that runs through my head and keeps me up at night, because that's the only time I really think about it. Like, I'm going to bed. Why though? No, there's questions I ask myself all the time, and I have asked myself multiple times, will science ever hit kind of a wall, a limit of what we can know? And then will we be able to get past that? Or will we accept that that's probably just all that we can understand? How do we justify what's beyond that? Do we still call that a work of God? Or, stuff like that. I'm asking myself weird questions all the time, but...
There's those us who deal with philosophy are like, those are normal questions.
I say that to everybody.
I said weird, and you looked at me like, that's not weird.
It's completely normal, yeah.
That's the kind of stuff that goes through my mind. So, yeah, even as a scientist, all the time I'm still questioning everything. Like, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
Is probably my biggest question. And I'll go back and I'll answer myself like, well, the point of me doing what I do is to then pass that knowledge down to the next generation who will supersede me. And then I ask, but who cares? I'm dead. So that just basic questions I ask myself, which I think is weird, but apparently not.
So, I mean, with how far we've come with science, we accept evolution now. We accept the Big Bang model of the universe. We don't know what the event was or what caused it.
Yeah, what preceded it.
Yeah, but the model is accurate to our knowledge. So with all that in mind, how do you today, and I'm not speaking of the young Earth creationists, who, if you don't know, the ones who think the Earth is 6,000 years old, how do you reconcile science and religion? Do you kind of have to say God was an intelligent designer who had a plan, or he was a prime mover who set things in motion and then they naturally went about? How would you kind of mesh the two?
Yeah, and I think meshing, that's a good technical term there, right? I see theology or religion and science overlapping. You talked about the young Earth creationists. A lot of those folks would say that my religion is true or the Bible is true, and so that anytime science conflicts with religion, my religious beliefs are going to trump science.
Yeah.
So science must be wrong. But then on the other hand, you have folks who would say science is always right, and anytime that religion conflicts with science, that science is right and religion is wrong.
Guilty.
We can begin to categorize each other into different typologies. My typology, though, is that I do see them overlapping. And I don't see it as a complete overlap, where you have like two circles and one is laid superimposed on top of the other one, but more it's like a Venn diagram. Mm-hmm. Because I think there's some like religious truth that has very little or nothing at all to do with science and vice versa, but I think that there is a little slither where they can mesh together. And so to kind of get back to the core of your question, I see God working and operating through scientific laws, through scientific principles. I have trouble with those traditional views of God where God is like supernaturally intervening within the world. It's like God is outside of the world, and every once in a while God decides to step in, overthrow all the laws of physics. Like, there's a passage in the Bible where God supposedly makes the sun stand still. well, we know now that the sun doesn't move, or rather the earth moves around the sun. Well, someone could say, well, wouldn't God then be able to make the earth stop? So it appeared as if the sun just froze in the sky. But as fast as the earth is spinning, if God would just automatically stop it, like everything would be floated off the earth, right? And then someone could say, well, if God, can do anything God wants to do, then God could stop the earth and still keep us on the earth. But you just keep adding all these layers upon layers upon layers to make this explanation. All of a sudden you just have this like huge laundry list of things that you have to say God did in order to intervene.
But
yeah, exactly. You always have you're adding these caveats to the conversation.
Yeah.
So I see God operating inside the world and inside the laws of physics rather than outside. And so I see God as kind of urging events to come about rather than kind of dictating or mandating that these things come about. So 13.7 billion years ago, I think that God began the process of kind of, I believe that there's some type of probably primordial matter that existed. And so that brings some challenges to some people's views that would say, well, God is the only thing that can be eternal. Well, maybe there was some stuff here that was also eternal, and God began to move upon that stuff and urge it to develop into the world that we eventually have today. And I should probably make the claim, too, that I am very open to a particular type of theology known as process theology, where you have a God that's not all-powerful, but you have a God that's all-loving and a God that's not all-knowing, that God doesn't necessarily know the future. So God, when he set out on this adventure billions of years ago, and maybe even before that, like there may have been other worlds that God created before ours. I think it would be naive to think that we're the only world to exist in this abundant universe. And so that maybe God had an ideal world that God wanted to create. But God encounters the laws of physics, and then whenever humans evolve, he has to deal with these conscious beings who have their own ideas of what they want to do, and we have wars and fight amongst each other. So while God has like this overall idea of what God would like to see happen, God's kind of ideal plan sometimes is thwarted by humans, and so God might try to steer us in a particular direction, but I kind of see the future as open, that there is not one definitive end that is going to happen, but there are multiple ends. It's kind of like one of these storybooks. I don't know if you ever read them as a child, where you could pick the different events throughout the story. I forget what they're called. I can't remember the name either.
I couldn't help you.
But you get to like page 10, and then it says, well, if you want your character to do A, go to page 63. If you want your character to do B, go to page 78. And so you remember these.
It twists and contorts the story to like 10 different endings.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So you could read the same book like 20 times, and it would be a different book within the book.
Yep.
And I kind of see the same thing for human history. I see the same thing for the history of the universe, that there can be multiple endings, that there doesn't have to be just one. And so that's God walking alongside of humanity rather than being this grand like puppet master who is controlling humans what we can do.
Big bearded guy up in the clouds.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a wild way of looking at it, and I've never heard it explained that way. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that sense of thinking that, and the whole going back to the eternal thing, that he might not be the only eternal being in the universe. Energy is eternal. Mm-hmm. It's one of the only things that we know. It cannot be created or destroyed. It always just is. And that's one thing that fascinates me about the universe. And I was kind of thinking about that, and in my mind I kind of dazed off for a second and was thinking, what if God is energy?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's you're making me think.
Good. I always tell my students that's my goal. If you get nothing else out of my classes, like at least hopefully we have some provocative conversations and to make you think.
It's working.
But coming from my Pentecostal roots, the Pentecostals have this idea that God's Spirit is working and is operative within the world, and so I have this like pan-entheistic view of God, that God is in all things. Not necessarily that God is all things, that you're not a God, I'm not a God, but that God lives and moves and breathes through all beings and all living things. And so it's almost like we are within God's being in a sense, rather than, again, this idea that God and the world are separate from one another.
Yeah.
And
stop playing with the phone. Have you seen the movie Lucy with...
I haven't.
What's her name? I don't know. So in Lucy, they invent this new drug that is... They gave it some weird name. But when a woman is in pregnancy, she gives off a certain hormone that generates the cells, the nervous system, the brain. It begins to form all of that inside the fetus. And they were able to turn that into a drug that you can take in whatever way. Well, they cut her open and they slip a pouch in her and give her a plane ticket and say, go here, after that you can go home. That we just need you for the pouch. So that's her, they're using her as luggage. But she sustained...
ethics questions come into play.
But she sustains an injury when she has this pouch in her. The pouch breaks open and she takes in the entire bag, and you're only supposed to take in like a grain. And it starts redeveloping her body, and it's a fictional story about how we start unlocking different parts of our brain, saying we only use 5%.
Right.
And as she absorbs more and more going through the storyline, she unlocks 20, 30, 40, and it'll show you like, oh, she's at 50%, this is what she can do now. And she starts like distorting matter and everything. She can break physical matter down and reiterate it into whatever she wants.
Now it's sounding familiar. Like, I haven't seen it, but I feel like I've seen at least the previews for the movie or something.
At the very end, she unlocks 100% of her brain, and she disappears. The only thing remaining is her clothes that just fall on the floor. And kind of like a cop who was helping her, he's sitting there like, where did she go? And his phone buzzes, and it just says, I am everywhere. And that's how the movie ends. And I was looking on, like, hoping that there was going to be a sequel to this. Yeah. And I'm reading all these blogs, and there's everybody putting in their 2 cents about it. Some are on a religious standpoint, philosophical standpoint, scientific standpoint, but pretty much everybody comes up to an agreement at the end saying that they're hinting that she became like a god because she's become everything. She's everywhere. She's not specifically one thing, but everything has her in it. And don't know how to explain this at all.
It's like the Force from Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly. She's become the Force. I'm pretty sure I read that in there somewhere also. Somebody had mentioned that she is the Force. Something like that. But it's funny that you had said that, because now that's what I'm going back to. It's one of my favorite movies because it definitely, scientifically, I mean, it's fascinating. Strictly theoretical, but... Right.
Definitely have to check that out. But as you were describing the movie, the first thing I thought was Buddhism and Hinduism. And I don't know if you've seen the movie or not. Maybe you can speak to it, since I know that we've talked about Buddhism and Hinduism a little bit. But, it sounds like you could draw a lot of parallels between her and enlightenment.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of the Eastern religions, the idea of enlightenment is that you kind of have this knowledge of everything, that you are aware of all the suffering in the world that is going around you, that you're aware of the causality within the world. So for instance, in Buddhism, they talk a lot about how we are unaware of suffering and that we're unaware of how our actions cause suffering within the world. However, the enlightened person is aware of those things.
Right.
And it's almost like if you're watching a play, but the unenlightened person, the curtains are closed except for a small crack. And so you can kind of see a little bit of what's going on stage, but you're blind to most of it. But the enlightened person, they get to watch the entire play with the curtains open.
And the more you study, the more the curtains recede back.
Right. And so in Buddhism, for example, the Tibetan Buddhism more specifically, the enlightened person ceases to exist as an individual person. And many Tibetan Buddhists actually, I was just listening to a lecture by Robert Thurman recently, and he said that the enlightened person, the Buddha, when we talk about the historical Buddha, for example, doesn't cease to exist, but is still around us and kind of everywhere, like you were explaining this kind of conscious, non-existent person in the movie. And so we're kind of absorbed into ultimate reality. And many Hindus have a similar belief that ultimate reality, sometimes referred to as Brahman, that when we finally break free from the cycle of life, we achieve moksha, that we no longer have this individual existence, but we're just kind of absorbed into this vast kind of reality, interconnected consciousness, or however you want to describe it. So I would almost guess that whoever created this movie has a lot of like Eastern philosophy background.
That would be cool.
Or it's just a really interesting coincidence. But I'm going to have to check it out now and read up on it and find out.
It's sitting right there if you want to borrow it. Great movie. It's funny that you mentioned Tibetan Buddhism.
I saw the look on your face. There's like a backstory or something here.
I studied it for about 4 years. And, I mean, I stayed at a monastery and studied under it and everything. I how am I wording this?
Well said.
Thank you. I used to go to a non-denominational Christian church, and it was back in 2000, oh my gosh, I don't even know what year it was, 2010, 11, something like that. I was baptized by my own choice, and I wanted to experience that. I felt a certain amount of devotion to it. And after doing that and picking back up on my education and looking more into the Bible, I saw a lot of things that I, A, didn't agree with, or B, I was just questioning too far, or just a lot of things I was disagreeing with. So I didn't completely give it up. I didn't banish it from my mind, but I wanted to explore what else was out there. And after studying a good 10, 12 different religions, I came across Buddhism, more specifically Tibetan Buddhism, and even more specifically Tibetan Taoism. And I saw, again, some things I agreed with, some things I thought were a little off, like having to give daily offerings to a Buddha statue. I'm like, that's money I'm spending for food. I'm going to eat that food. But I liked Tibetan Taoism because I look at it not so much of a religious standpoint, but as guidelines to living. I got that specifically, which is the Moni mantra, and it's the mantra of compassion. It's all about forgiveness. Okay. That if anybody harms me, I forgive them, even if they don't want my forgiveness. I still give that to them. Or if I've hurt anybody, that I ask them to forgive me. Or if I've hurt myself, I forgive myself. That you don't hang on to anything; you just let it go. So I was glad when you mentioned that. I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah, I saw the tattoos when we were first talking before the podcast started, and I was going to ask, and then we got off onto different topics. But oftentimes you see tattoos, you don't know if there's any type of religious significance, or someone's just like, oh, that's a cool symbol, I'm going to get that tattooed on me.
Yeah, there's a whole story behind this. It goes all the way up.
Nice.
It's got.
So did you study then in the United States, or did you study outside of the U.S.?
I studied in the U.S. There's actually a monastery down in Baltimore County, and I used to live in Maryland. It was maybe an hour drive for me, and I would just go there for weeks at a time. And I mean, I studied all sorts of things, and enlightenment came up multiple times. That the entire monastery, we had certain monks who did certain things. They were given certain tasks to complete each day, and your tasks would rotate as the week went on. But you had no outside sources. You brought nothing with you, absolutely no baggage. When they accepted you in, they accepted you as a hollow state, and we will feed into you and see what you become. But like it's like filling a cup, that there is no water in the cup, and as your cup becomes more full, that's more knowledge you have. And you can choose when you leave to either empty your cup, or maybe your cup is overflowing. And that was one of the first metaphors. I sat down with the, not the enlightened one, but the head of the monastery, that one monk, that I don't think he actually had a specific title. But he and I sat down at a table, and I was asking him all sorts of questions, and he never answered a single one of them. But he placed one cup in front of me and one cup in front of him, and he started pouring his tea into his cup, and he stopped halfway. And then he poured tea into the cup in front of me until it was overflowing. And I didn't understand. This went on for like a week, and every single day, and eventually I just stopped asking questions, and he poured his cup of tea half full, and then he didn't pour any in mine, and he said, "Now your cup is empty, let us fill it." And I was like, I don't understand what that means. And as studies went on, I started to understand it, and after 2-3 years, however long it was, when I was getting ready to leave, I had been dressed in my robes and everything, and they have accepted me as one of them. I make them sound like it's a whole nother world. I was accepted into the community. They filled my cup only about a quarter full.
Okay.
And I was like, I get it. I understand now. That it fascinated me how that whole process worked, that they fed what knowledge you were willing to accept. They would not teach you what you didn't want to know.
Yeah. And that's so different from the backgrounds that, and maybe you had this in your Christian non-denominational church, but at least in mine, that you didn't ask a lot of questions, or it's okay to ask certain questions, but then there are some questions that you don't ask, or when you're looking for the answers, there are certain places that you don't go to find answers. Like in my background, if you were to dabble in like Buddhism or begin to read Buddhist texts, like you're messing with the devil there. You're going to open yourself up to being possessed by a demon, these types of things. And there's another area of interreligious dialogue that absolutely fascinates me as well too. And I mentioned earlier about this search for truth, no matter where it leads. And so I've come from that traditional background where you only look in your Christian church, and not all Christian churches are areas of truth either. Like you want to stay away from the Catholics; they're bad people. And my Pentecostal roots would say you stay away from, like, the frozen chosen is what they might call them, like the Presbyterians and folks like that.
The frozen chosen. Yes. I like that.
And so I've come to the point where I would say that other religions can teach us truth that we can learn from them, and so hearing stories like yours, it just fascinates me, and I love learning about other religions and finding out what similarities do we have, or what insights can they offer.
Right. That's the same thing that was fascinating me when I was doing some religious study. And it wasn't just for the knowledge of it. I just felt like I wanted to belong to something. And that was my purpose at the time. I was like, I feel the need to be part of whatever. I just don't know what whatever is yet, and that's just the one that I happen to fall into and agree with most.
Okay.
There were plenty of times I was still like, I don't know, but overall, the way that they melded me was, this is what you should live by. Take it easy.
And from my perspective, like, if God does exist and God is this ultimate being, then there's not going to be just one way of looking at God, that there's going to be multiple ways of looking at God. And I think that one group of people have cornered the market on how to understand God. Again, I think that that's naive. Now, does that mean that I believe everyone's view of God is equally valid? No, I mean, I'm going to disagree with people. Like, there again, getting back to some of my philosophical tendencies as well, too. Like, I'm going to argue my perspectives. Like, I'm right, you're wrong type of mentality.
What is truth?
Yeah, exactly. Trying to get to the core of truth. So I'm not a relativist where I would say that all things are true, but I am open to the idea that some people might have a way of looking at God that is different for me, and there might be something I can learn from that person and give me a fuller understanding of God than what I had before.
Well, when you were describing what you thought God was earlier, you were talking about some primordial matter, and maybe God urges that to do something, and then that leads to the Big Bang or whatever. It sounds so similar to some of the Eastern religions, like Taoism.
Right.
It sounds very much like Taoism.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you say, well, not funny, but it's interesting that you say that you believe there are different interpretations to be made of God, because those Eastern religions would say it's whatever, the Logos or the Tao, or whichever one you want to pick.
Or like Brahman.
Or Brahman.
Yeah.
And your description of God is more Western, maybe more Christian, but they still were astoundingly among the same lines when I was listening to you describe it.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of compatibility there, that they're not one and the same, but again, it's kind of like a theme that there's some overlapping talking points where I could sit down and have a conversation with a Buddhist or a Hindu or someone who follows Taoism, and that I could almost, hear some of my views in them, and maybe they might hear some of their views in my conversations as well. In fact, one of my favorite Christian theologians of the 20th century is Paul Tillich. And Tillich studied Eastern religions, particularly more so towards the end of his life. He died in the 60s. And in one of his readings, he says, if I had to do it over again, he said, I would probably start with the Eastern religions. Because he too found a lot of commonalities with his theology, a lot of interesting points that he would like to explore a little bit more there. And I think that some of my affinity for Paul Tillich has kind of worn off in the sense that it's opened me up to the Eastern religions.
Yeah.
And again, going back to my view, understanding that God's Spirit is working everywhere. I wouldn't say that God's Spirit is just working within Christianity, but God's Spirit is also working within all of these other religions. So when I say that, I don't mean that God's Spirit is necessarily working in an evangelical way. Because a lot of people, when they say, well, God's working in that Hindu over there, means that God's trying to convert that Hindu to Christianity. More so, I would say that Hindu doesn't necessarily need to become a Christian. That Hindu is fine being a Hindu, because when that Hindu feeds the homeless, they're doing the work of God through their religious tradition. They don't need to convert to Christianity to feed the homeless,
right.
Or whatever the Muslim builds, a house for the poor. They don't need to convert to Christianity to do that, and I would say that that's God's work. They're already doing God's work. but I would say that they're moved to compassion through God's Spirit, and that no religion, even my own Christianity, should feel that they have a, what's the word I'm looking for? They shouldn't feel that they own God, in a sense, that God can only work within them, and that religion more so is a human construction, that religion wasn't something created by God.
Right.
And so I see religions more as historical traditions, more so than theological traditions. There's still theology involved there. But it's funny that sometimes you can find a Jewish person and a Christian person who have more in common with each other. You know, let's say you have a liberal Jew and a liberal Christian who both believe that there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. They have more in common with each other than, let's say, the liberal Christian and the fundamentalist Christian. The fundamentalist Christian is probably going to believe that homosexuality is a sin. Mm-hmm. That fundamentalist Christian is going to be knocking heads with that liberal Christian.
Yep.
So the Jewish person and the Christian might get along better than the Christian and the Christian.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes it's where you find yourself culturally, where you're born, where you're reared. So, you know, if I'm born in India, there's a good chance that I'm going to become a Hindu. If I'm born in Saudi Arabia, there's probably a good chance that I'm going to become a Muslim. And so I think our religion is often shaped by our culture. And so we grow up in these historical backgrounds, and these historical traditions, all these different religions, have these theological commonalities.
Love it, because I have always thought that culture versus religion need to be picked apart. They need to be separated. I feel that culture is the way that you're raised, and a lot of times religion has to go into that. Culture is a geographical standpoint. Like, if you're from this part of the world, you're probably studying this culture. You're growing up in this culture. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to agree, disagree, or even be null or mute about whatever religion that is. I've always thought that they don't have to be separated, but
yeah, I was going to
I don't want to say they should be either. No.
Yeah, when you first said picked apart, I was like, I might take some issue with you on that. Because in a sense, I don't think that, religion and culture can be separated, because I think they're so blended together sometimes. But
yeah, in some cases, yes. I feel that there's other cases. Look at me. I live in the middle of Pennsylvania. In York City, how many people in the world know, oh yeah, he's from York, I know where that is? No. Mm-hmm. And I grew up I grew up in a town called Street, which every single time I say, yeah, I grew up in Street, and they ask me, no, what town? So, I grew up in these places that very few people know, but I study avidly a religion that's half a world away. Mm-hmm. So my culture doesn't agree with my religion. Right. So being in this area, I should be Christian or any denomination of that, yet I've chosen an Eastern religion. Right. So that's kind of my point. I'm not saying they should be or need to be separated. No,
that makes sense. That makes sense. But you could even argue that your culture, in a sense, led you to Eastern religions. In a way, it's your kind of rejection of culture that led you to the Eastern religions.
Drove you away.
Drove you away,
yeah. Yeah, okay.
So
I'll take that. I'll take that. That's a good point. And that's pretty much what happened, too. My dad is not religious. My mother is Christian, but I have never once in my life seen her study it. She just says that she is. So it was never pressed on me. I strictly explored it out of my own curiosity, and eventually it did get to a point that I was like, I don't know how much I really agree with this, and it led me to search for anything else. So Yeah, I'd have to give you that one. Do you have anything?
No, I think
Okay,
metaphysically we've covered a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a grab bag of all these random topics. I mean, they're connected, but.
So, it seems like a good point to transition. You do have a book out.
I do.
Let's go into it.
Yeah,
I want to hear. I know a little bit of what it's about, but for John and others, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so let me begin by telling you the title of the book.
Yeah, so we can order
John
it.
hasn't known anything. So it's Evil Spirits and Possession, and Emergentist Theology of the Demonic.
I'll just Google that.
So, what set me out on this topic is that when I was working on my PhD, like many PhD students trying to figure out, well, what am I going to write my dissertation on?
Mm-hmm.
There's a few people who go into the program, they know what they're going to write on, and they stick with that throughout. And I'm very envious of those folks, but I was the type of person that I'm like, I have a lot of different interests, but I'm not quite sure what I want to spend the next 7 years of my life studying. One sure thing is that most people who begin to study their topic then end up saying, you know what, I've had a lot of this, I need a break, I need to start doing something else because I've been studying this one topic for 7 years. But in one of my classes, through my entire PhD program, which I did at Regent University in Virginia Beach, was all about pneumatology, which is the study of the spirit. And you've heard me make mention already in our discussion today of how there's spirits everywhere, spirits in us, moving us, giving us life, giving us vitality. And so that was a lot of the program. And so we would look at like Eastern Orthodox Christian theologians who talked about the spirit. So we are inundated with this. And I began to ask the question of, well, where is the spirit absent? So if the spirit's all around us, but is there any place where the spirit does not work and does not operate? And one thing that got me asking this question was Jesus' crucifixion on the cross, where he cries out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I began thinking about this passage, like how do we understand this from a pneumatological perspective? Because coming from a Trinitarian Christian background, we Trinitarians believe that there's a threeness to God. There's the Father, there's the Son, and there's the Holy Spirit. And so when Jesus is crucified, often theologians talk about this divine drama between the Father and the Son. So the Son, Jesus, cries out, God, why have you forsaken me? And oftentimes, Christian theologians say, well, God being holy, the Father, cannot even look upon sin. And so when Jesus the Son takes upon all the sin upon the world, upon himself, that the God the Father has to turn his back towards the Son because the Son is just so filled with the sin of the world. And so I got to thinking, well, that's an interesting binitarian view, in a sense that there's two persons that are interacting with each other, but where's the Holy Spirit in this whole interaction? And so that got me thinking, well, maybe when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not talking about God the Father, but maybe he's talking about the Holy Spirit. Which then, to me, made a little more sense, because when you look at the Gospels, Jesus' ministry begins with his baptism by John, and the Holy Spirit descends upon Jesus. So I'm thinking, well, here are some nice bookends. You have Jesus being filled with the Spirit at the beginning of his ministry, and on the cross, the end of his ministry, the Spirit's leaving him. And so this is going back to your question on hell, which I haven't gotten to write on that. This is leading up to my dissertation. Long story.
Yeah.
I still want to write on that. So I'm glad you're kind of intrigued by that, because I'm still intrigued by it. Maybe one of these days I'll have enough time that I can focus some attention. So where was I going with that? So this goes back to your question on hell. So me having questions about even the existence of hell, some traditional Christians would say when Jesus died, he actually descended into hell. And we have the Nicene Creed that talks about this, and this idea that Jesus opens the gates of hell, and all the people who aren't able to enter into heaven are now able to enter into heaven. And I'm not buying this. And so I'm thinking maybe hell for Jesus was experiencing the absence of the Spirit. Whoa. That he that he experienced godlessness for a moment. And that's hell, godlessness. Whoa. So anyways, I end up going to my professor, and I'm talking about this to my professor, and he wasn't quite as intrigued as what you're at least pretending to be right now. And so he said, well, you know what? Why don't you write about the demonic? Because it's kind of in the same area, talking about like the absence of the Spirit, but instead of talking about the Holy Spirit, you're talking about evil spirits. And my supervisor said, this is something that I've wanted to write on. I've been writing on other projects, but if it's something you want to take upon yourself, I'm more than willing to relinquish that to you, and you can do this. Well, being a wise PhD student, thinking, well, if my advisor thinks that this is smart to write upon, then I should probably write on this topic, right? Because a lot of the PhD, and maybe you can speak to this as well, is jumping through the hoops, making your advisor happy. Make your advisor happy, get your degree, and then you can do what you want to do.
Pretty much done that a few times.
Right. So that's how I ended up getting on the topic of writing about the demonic. So that's the long version of it.
That is cool, though. Mm. That's you view things in such a different aspect than I was ever taught to view them by the church. And I mean,
it's been a long road.
At the church, I mean, I've got the Holy Bible, and then the one right next to it, the story is actually a chronological order of all the events in the Bible, and that's how I was taught. Was taught everything in chronological order.
Because everything makes sense. It's always laid out in perfect order in the Bible,
right? Right, absolutely.
Being sarcastic, of course.
And we were told, like, this is the way it was. You can't question this because it's God. And, I mean, I can just imagine some of the faces of the people I used to go to church with. If they heard your explanation of it or your thoughts on it, they're like, no, right. Blasphemy. Yeah. I mean, that's really fascinating. That's remarkable to me, the way that you look into it. I love that. Is your book available to the public?
It is.
Okay, how can I get a copy?
So you go to Amazon or any other bookstore. I actually don't like Amazon all that much, so I should have given them a plug here, but Barnes & Noble or some other place. But it's published through Brill.
Okay.
One hurdle is that it's an academic book.
Okay.
So academic books are not published in mass like books that are made to be like New York Times bestsellers, who publish, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. I think James Comey's book, they were publishing like 700,000 copies of that. I was just like, wow, that's a lot of copies. So, an academic book, they might publish, a few hundred or 1,000 copies, and libraries will buy them up. But I say all of that to say that it's not a cheap book. I think it's like $80 because, again, they're not selling.
That's most of mine.
Yeah, all your science books, I'm sure that those are pretty pricey as well.
Yeah, that one on quantum plasmatics right there put me back about $210.
Yeah. So that's nothing for you. But in the book, I basically make 3 moves. One is a historical section where I look at the history of Christian theology and how has the church understood demons. And so there's where I get into interesting topics about... my mind totally went blank. So... in the book of Genesis, there's this very brief mention of giants.
Okay.
And so folks have read that and said, whoa, it talks about giants here in this one brief verse, but who are these giants and where did they come from?
Yeah.
And so some of the early Christian theologians began to theorize that there were these angels in heaven who came, God sent them to earth to kind of watch over humans, almost like these guardian angels. But some of these angels ended up falling in love with human women and ended up having sexual relations with them. And that the women ended up getting pregnant and giving birth to these like half angel, half human creatures who end up being giants.
Huh.
And it's believed that these giants were killed in Noah's flood.
Okay.
So they weren't brought onto the ark, they died. And that when they died, their bodies ceased to exist, but their spirits continued to live. And so demons today are apparently the spirits of these ancient or primitive giants. And so that's how some early Christians theorize that demons came about.
Huh.
And for some of them, it goes back to the problem of theodicy, of why does God allow evil in the world? Well, for them, if God had just created demons, then that makes God responsible for demonic activity. Whereas if we can say, well, these angels on their own free will disobeyed God, had sex with humans, created these babies that became giants who died, and now their spirits are demons, that kind of lets God off the hook for creating these demonic beings. And so that's how demons were theorized by some early Christians, not all of them. But then later on, through the work of Augustine pretty much rejected this theory and gave credence to the idea that demons are fallen angels themselves.
That's the one that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that's the traditional Christian view. But ironically, that wasn't the earliest Christian view. That just became the predominant one because Augustine was such a major figure in the history of the church.
Okay.
And had so much influence upon its theology for the next 1,500 years. And so I also talk about post-Augustinian views of the demonic. I move up into the modern era and the contemporary era as well too. So in a modern church, you begin having these Christian theologians that begin to doubt the existence of demons altogether and say, well, we don't believe in them anymore. We have science. We know why these things end up happening and occurring. But one reason why that's somewhat problematic is because in our contemporary context, when you look at anthropologists who study cultures in the two-thirds world, or the global south, you have demonic possession phenomenon, which is fairly common. Like there have been some studies where you have like 60 to 70% of cultures have this phenomenon of spirit possession. And so these anthropologists are trying to answer the question, well, why are people acting possessed? What explanation is there for it, and why is it so widespread? It's not like you have just one culture where it's present, but you have these cultures that like really don't interact with each other. And you would think like, well, maybe it's learned behavior, but if they don't interact with each other, like how then is it learned behavior?
Right.
So you have like these anthropological explanations, anything from, well, it's the food that they eat. And so they are deprived of certain nutrients, and so they end up going into these like fits where they begin convulsing and flailing their arms about and speaking in what seems to be these weird languages. And so it's a deficiency in their diet, which has been rejected by a lot of anthropologists. But you have all these theories asking, well, why is this the case? And so I, in my book, try to theorize that, well, there is this reality known as the demonic that exists, and that's one reason why there is possession. Now, that's not to say that all cases of possession are due to demonic influences. Like, I think there are psychological explanations to these things, but I don't think the psychological explanations explain everything.
I was just going to ask, like, about, say somebody has a disability. not sure what kind of disability would cause something like that. Maybe if the person's having a seizure. I mean, to a cluster of individuals who have never seen somebody have a seizure are completely unaware of what that is. And then all of a sudden, they just start seizing, eyes roll back, foaming from the mouth, whole 9 yards, whatever. Or if, maybe they ate some shrooms that they really shouldn't have.
And begin hallucinating and so forth.
The burning bush.
Yeah. Stuff like that.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that those events do occur. And there again is the God of the gaps. Well, we don't have a scientific explanation, so it's an evil spirit. But and when you look at psychological explanations, I also have a section on anthropology and psychology and sociology in my book. So you have Freud, who would argue that it's neurosis that's causing what seems to be possession. You have Carl Jung, who is saying, yes, it is neurosis, but it's more than what Freud is saying. Freud would say it's all sexual repression that's causing what appears to be demonic possession. And Jung is going to say it's not all about sex. Sorry, Freud, to burst your bubble there. Freud is saying all about that. But Jung would say that it's any type of repression, and so people subconsciously are kind of letting out all that stuff inside that's been repressed, right? And so, but again, the root cause of it for him is neurosis. It's a psychological condition. But what many psychologists have learned today is that people who exert possession behavior oftentimes are just as healthy mentally, if not more healthy mentally. So it's not a mental disorder that is causing it. And so they've actually had to rewrite sections of the DSM, which is the psychological manual, so to speak, to account for the fact that this isn't a psychological disorder, but it's actually in some cultures healthy.
That is wild.
We in the West, we view it as unhealthy, so in our context it doesn't make sense, but in other cultures it's perfectly normal.
Nah, he good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's strange.
You haven't read the book, that's why.
Well,
so
I guess that's my problem. That's just, they had to rewrite parts of the DSM, which I can't remember what that stands for.
I'm drawing a blank.
And statistical manual.
Yeah, something along those lines.
It's what they use to diagnose mental disorders and illnesses in the field of psychology. There's a ton. There's like hundreds.
Yeah, and what many psychologists today argue is that it's a form of dissociation, where basically you kind of have these different, you're able to separate yourself from yourself, if that makes any sense. And it might sound weird, but everyone does it on a regular basis. Like, have you ever been driving down the road and you begin to daydream, and then a couple minutes later you kind of snap out of the daydream and you're like, wait a second, how'd I get here? and I've done this, and I have a brief panic attack. I was so caught up in my daydream that I could have been in an accident. I wasn't really paying attention.
You think you go into an autopilot. Your body just knows what to do while your mind goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
I did it on the way to work. I got onto Route 30. Next thing I know, I pulled into the driveway at work. And I was like, what happened in the last 35 minutes?
Right. And so we do it all the time. And so when you first looked at me, you had this weird expression when I said we do it all the time. And I just gave you an example to prove that you do it. And so in a sense, you removed yourself from yourself. You almost had this, it wasn't an out-of-body experience, but that's kind of what happens in possession, where folks can snap out of a possessed state and not really know, well, what just happened? Just like we snap out of the daydream and are like, well, what just happened? How did we get here?
Right. So that's what happens when that happens.
Yeah, so you're not when you're daydreaming, you're not having a mental episode where you're completely neurotic and insane. It's a normal occurrence.
Get off the road! No, that's me every morning. That's cool. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably also important to mention that when I talk about evil and I talk about the demonic, I'm not talking about these individual spirits. I sometimes refer to them as like Caspers, if you ever seen the old TV show or the movie or the cartoon. You know, you have this like ghost that's floating around, and we have this image of this like evil spirit like coming into our body and taking over our body. And I don't have that understanding of the demonic.
Yeah.
It's a much more nuanced view of it. And I think the problem with that is a scientific one. Is because you have a duality between the physical world and the spiritual world, and these are two different domains, or at least that's how it's often been understood. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that if the physical realm is different than the spiritual realm in substance, in essence, then how does the spiritual realm interact with the physical realm?
Yeah.
How is there causality? And this goes back to Descartes. When Descartes talks about his two substances, we are both a thinking substance and we're also a physical substance. Well, if the mind is merely a thinking substance, how does the mind then tell the body what to do? How's their interaction? And of course, Descartes says, well, we have this pineal gland in our brain that allows communication between the thinking substance and the body, which we now know medically there is no such thing as that. But so many religious folks, especially Christians, still hold on to substance dualism, and God's a different substance, demons and angels are different substances than the physical world. But then, if demons possess people, how do they do it if they're completely different in type and form and essence?
Right.
It's a problem. But then on the other side, you have the material reductionists, many scientists who want to say there is no spiritual realm, the only realm that exists is the physical realm. And I want to say that that's overly reductionistic, because I think there are realities that exist that you can't reduce down to just physics alone. And let me give you another example of this.
Okay.
So we can talk about something like the American flag. So when some people see the American flag being burned, like they are just outraged, like something inside of them just erupts.
Yeah.
Especially like, veterans who fought and literally shed blood, sweat, and tears for our country. Now, if I were to write the flag in an equation of physics, here's what the flag is made up of. Here are the atoms, the neutrons, the electrons that are made up in the flag, and wrote that down on a piece of paper. That does not encapsulate what the flag actually is.
Right.
So the existence of the flag, its being or its ontology, is actually greater than the mere physical constituents that it's made up of.
Its symbolism has more weight.
Yeah. And so I would say that the essence of something, its ontology, is not only just the physical stuff, that's part of it, but it's also the sociology around it. So our society, talking about culture again, our culture kind of ascribes meaning to the flag. And so the flag's meaning isn't just bottom up from physics moving up to the conscious realm, but there are conscious factors that are also making us act in certain ways.
Right.
And so when we see the flag being burned, or at least some of us, we have this emotional response.
Right.
Or another example would be like a coin or a dollar bill. The physics of it is one thing, but it's the meaning of it. Not just the meaning, but its existence, its core of what it is greater than just the metal that coin is made up of. And so we living in a capitalistic society, we can talk about the effects that money has upon us quite easily, right? or going to vote. You pull the lever, or you punch out the hanging chad if you're in Florida or something along those lines. So, however you vote, even just the action of raising a hand to vote.
Yep.
We can write all the muscles. We can record all the muscles that it takes to raise your hand to vote. But there's much more to raising your hand than just the physics of it all.
Right. There's so much more that goes into just everything.
Yeah.
I mean, like this table, I can write down the physics of the table, but to me, I don't want anything to happen to it because it's my table. Now I have to go out and replace it.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And like money, it's got a monetary value, and that's what we value almost our entire lives on, because that's how we were raised. Like, oh, you got to have the big house with the fancy car, and all that kind of stuff. Like, so that nickel's not just a nickel, that's 5 cents.
Yeah, and so that money makes us do sometimes crazy, wild, stupid things.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
That's the truth.
Yeah, and so there's this like overarching reality of money that has downward effects upon our individual lives and our social lives.
Yep.
So we could talk about money in this kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? Drawing a blank here again. Kind of you can't touch. You can touch and feel money, but again, there's this reality of money that you can't touch and
this
feel.
Intangible.
Yeah, intangible. Thank you very much. There's this intangible reality to money. So bring this kind of back to my view of the demonic. I think that there's this kind of intangible reality of the demonic, that it's something that exists, that it is based upon the physical realm, because we couldn't have the demonic, we wouldn't have evil without the physical realm. It's also based upon, I think, human consciousness. I don't think that you have evil and the demonic without human consciousness. Before humans, you just have animals. Animal gets hungry. The lion sees the monkey, eats the monkey, that's dinner. There's no morality there. It just is. But once you have conscious beings like humans, we don't act just according to instinct. Like, we can then evaluate our actions. And so I think once humans evolve, then you have the evolution of the demonic realm. That out of this human consciousness, you have this other reality that has downward effects upon us. Perfect example of this is Nazi Germany, where you pull individual people aside and you say, okay, here's what's going on. They would be appalled at their actions, but when they are in that context, they get caught up in this higher reality, this demonic reality that causes normal people to do things that they typically wouldn't do. In a sense, it's like the whole country was almost hypnotized, or I would use the word possessed, by this thing that's even beyond Hitler himself.
Wow.
I'm
really glad you brought up evolution, actually. Because
here we go.
when you were talking about how before there were modern aware humans, there were animals, but in between that are all these transitional species, like Australopithecus, or something along those lines. I don't know. I only took one anthropology class, but it's kind of intriguing to me how you tied that together, and how the demonic evolved along with us and along with our consciousness and our view of the world, I guess. So.
Yeah, and that goes back to my view that I don't think you can just responsibly reject evolution. That if I'm going to be a sincere, authentic, religious person that also is open to truth in other realms, like, I've got to take into account evolution as well too. And here's where the subtitle of my book comes into play: an emergentist theology of the demonic, because I believe that there are different ontological levels, like the realm of physics, the realm of chemistry, the realm of biology, and then consciousness, and on top of consciousness you have the demonic, which I don't think that's the only realm above human consciousness. I think there's also, you might call it the divine reality as well too, that both of them are in existence. But think about it, you can't have chemistry without physics. Chemistry is based upon physics. But you can't reduce chemistry down to the laws of physics alone.
Right.
Chemistry, in a sense, has different laws that emerge out of physics. And the same thing with biology, like evolution. So biology is based upon chemistry, which is based upon physics. But again, I don't know if you want to call them the laws of biology, but Darwin's the principles that his theory are based upon, things like survival of the fittest and so forth. Those are kind of the guidelines that biology tends to follow, these patterns that it falls into. And again, you can't reduce that down to the realm of chemistry or the realm of physics either. That the biological realm operates on these different principles. Like, talk about survival of the fittest in the realm of chemistry and physics. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't.
No.
It wouldn't, because if you're saying the survival of the fittest, well, there's a philosophical question.
Yeah.
What makes you the fittest?
Mm-hmm.
Or what do you have that nobody else has that will allow you to survive? Something like that. And that's where physics wouldn't really be able to put a play in it. Because as a physicist, I can sit there and be like, well, he's all muscle and he has the highest stamina, but this guy's also more intelligent, so this guy can easily rip him in half, but he can lay a trap, and I wouldn't be able to sit there and say, physically, I've got no clue who's going to survive.
Yeah, I mean, there again was where the universe is kind of open to a bit of chance, because sometimes what appears to us to be the more fittest, the more fit, the more strong, doesn't necessarily survive because there are these other factors that we either didn't know or that just emerge out of interactions of things.
Right.
And so here's again where I think that upper tier levels like consciousness can have downward effects. Just like someone can kind of think themselves into being sick. I might not be sick, but if I think that I'm sick, I end up getting sick.
That is an actual thing. I don't know if you knew this, but let's say that somebody is in an enclosed space and the person next to them is like throwing their guts up. If that person's mind will subconsciously convince the body that whatever's wrong with them is now wrong with you, and even though there's nothing wrong with you, you'll start throwing up.
Well, that happens with emotions too. When something happens right when we wake up and we have a frown on our face for the rest of the day, we're going to be in a bad mood because your brain is picking up signals that your face is showing these signs of whatever, sadness, anger,
disarray,
whatever it may be. And so your brain's going to think you're in a bad mood. Well, the opposite's true as well with happiness. If you throw a smile on your face, even if something bad happens, you'll probably end up in a better mood.
Well, then your brain starts releasing chemicals and endorphins, which then affect the rest of your body. So that's that top-down effect that I'm talking about. Another good example would be our ancestors were lactose intolerant.
Yeah.
And eventually many humans developed the intolerance for lactose. And there's a theory that it's because of religion. Because when you look at like Hinduism, who uses dairy products in their religious rituals, then they begin to ingest, dairy products, and as a result, their body begins to change in order to accommodate for the lactose. And so there's where you have religious practices actually affecting the chemistry and biology of the body.
Wow.
Well, there you can reconcile science and religion.
Yeah, really. Just don't get me started on that. I want to backtrack way earlier in our conversation about how God is good.
Yes.
So, what's your take on that first? I'll start off just asking you, like, do you think God is good?
I feel like this is a trap question.
I don't have a set answer. I want to get your input first.
My initial gut reaction would be say, yes, God is good, God is loving, God is just. I want to affirm those characteristics.
Okay. So, thinking that God is good, now back to what I was saying, like, tsunami wipes out some thousands of people, what is justifiable about that would mean that's good? Because if God is all loving, all powerful, or however, wouldn't he be able to have saved those people, or just stop the tsunami from happening? Wouldn't he have been able to dip his finger in there somehow to at least lessen the blow?
Yeah. And I agree with your sentiments there of questioning those views. And that's one reason why my affinity, again, for process theology comes through. Okay. This idea that while God is all good and all loving and just, I don't think that God is necessarily all powerful, that God's not necessarily all knowing in terms of knowing the future.
Right.
And so I would say that maybe God didn't know that the tsunami was going to happen, or maybe right before the tsunami God could kind of see that there was going to be a tsunami, but God's not all powerful in the sense that God does not disrupt the laws of physics to intervene to stop the tsunami.
Right, like you said earlier, that he lives within our laws.
Yeah. So for me, God is the God who suffers with those who have been struck by the tsunami.
Okay.
Or those who have experienced a volcanic eruption, or we could talk about the school shooting in Texas. I'm sure there are lots of people questioning, well, why didn't God stop the shooter?
I'm sure somebody's asking.
Yeah, exactly. Or here's a good example. This came up in my class not too long ago. You might recall the bridge in, I think, Miami, Florida that recently collapsed.
Yeah.
And a couple people died. So my question was, well, if God is all powerful, then why didn't God prevent the bridge from collapsing? And pressing the student even further, I said, well, couldn't God have prevented that bridge? Or if God wanted the bridge to collapse, couldn't he have done it, say, 3 a.m. when no one was traveling on the busy highway? Why cause it to fall during rush hour traffic?
Right.
And so, my answer would be that God's not all powerful. God doesn't stop it. But God's, in a sense, more powerful because God is able to empathize with the hurting, with those who are suffering. Like, if God knew that bridge was going to collapse, God wouldn't have been surprised. Right. I mean, it would have been like, no big deal. I use the analogy of, let's say, Christmas. Mm-hmm. If I already know what's going to be under the tree for Christmas, when I open the presents, it's like, no big deal. Yeah, exactly. Like, Christmas loses its magic in a sense.
Right.
Opening the presents, I'm going to be bored. I already know what's in them.
Right.
So if God knew the bridge was going to fall, then God, in a sense, is not feeling the pain because God's like, I already knew that was going to happen. No surprise here. Right. It's like watching the same movie 100 times. You already know the ending. You watch Titanic, 100 times. You know the boat's going to sink, right? But God is able to empathize because God is experiencing things as they unfold in a similar way to the way that we experience them.
Being powerless to have stopped it.
Yeah, right.
Having to live within this physical dimension where we are standing there watching the bridge collapse. We feel that pain of it happening. We can emphasize our sorrows with the individuals involved in it. But ultimately, we can't do anything.
Right, because God is just as shocked as us.
Right.
God is just as sorrowful. And God is just as, pissed off, at the shooter and is angry that these things happened. Yeah. So God is experiencing those things. It's like, you watch the movie for the first time, you have all of these feelings overwhelming you, and God is experiencing that. And so God sits with us in the suffering, that God is there with us. And this goes back to my whole theology of the cross once again. God, in the person of Jesus, is also able to do that because Jesus also experienced suffering. God also experienced the absence of goodness and is able to empathize with us in that way too.
And I like the other aspect because we're focusing on a lot of negative occurrences here. But let's say that, somebody graduates, somebody releases a book, somebody gets married. Like, all these good things can happen. Somebody gets that promotion, and God can also be there and feel that joy.
Right. I'm glad you brought that out. That's an important point.
Because we're being all dark here. But, so in that same aspect, it's a lot of people will focus on that sort of stuff and be like, oh, well, you can't explain that this natural, like an earthquake kills 200 people, and everybody's going to be like, oh, well, why didn't God stop it? Well, at the same time, like, he's going to feel that pain. But so with his, I shouldn't call it an ability, but for the lack of a better term, his ability to be everywhere at all times, always, at the same time, he is also capable of feeling that joy of something else that's happening on the other side of the planet. And that so much more opens my mind to the vast, overwhelming capabilities of what a God potentially could be. I've kind of stemmed myself away from the belief of a God, but hearing this aspect of it now has me questioning.
Okay. I was gonna say, preach it, brother, because you're talking about God's everywhere and able to experience the joy as we are. I'm like, that's some good stuff. I like that.
I mean, that really opens up my mind. I never looked at it that way. Like, that's awesome.
What I really like about this perspective on God is how much more human God sounds. And it could be flipped the other way and say, oh, now that we view him as empathetic, he's actually even more godly. But just for the sake of discussion, it really humanizes God. When you say that God is not all powerful, or God is not all knowing, or both.
Right.
Because humans aren't.
Yeah.
And we empathize. One of the biggest markers of mankind is empathy, and the empathy that we have for each other and other creatures and things like that. So I think that really brings God more down to earth and less of this untouchable divine
sentient.
Just entity that you can't get near.
Yeah. And I think that's can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? I mean, like,
depending on how you look at humanity.
Well, that too, and also the theological perspective that you're coming from. So, someone who maybe questions traditional views of God, you're like, hey, that God doesn't sound quite so bad. Like, God might actually be a little bit palatable. But if you're talking to like your hardcore fundamentalist Christian to say that that makes God more human, they're gonna reject that and say, I don't like that idea at all.
Sure.
But my response is, as a Christian, if I believe that Jesus is God in the flesh, isn't the core of your Christian belief is that God is human? So why do you have a problem with the humanness of God as you mentioned it? But here's again where I think the culture comes into play. Why do we have these views of God as this unchanged, unmoved being? Well, because of Greco-Roman philosophy, right? You have the Logos, who is unchanged by humankind. Humans are influenced by the Logos, but the Logos is untouched by humanity.
Right.
And you also have Christianity then developing out of Greco-Roman philosophy into medieval philosophy, where you had kings ruling. And so we're going to compare God to a king. Well, the king is untouchable. You don't approach the king. You treat the king with utmost respect. You don't... The king doesn't empathize with you at all. The king is in his castle, away from all the problems of the world. And so I think Greco-Roman philosophy, medieval political views influence views of God. And I think that we're at the point now where theology we're far enough from that we can say, well, culture impacted those views of God, and maybe we need to, here's where maybe we need to take that culture out of those views of God and rethink our current understandings. Well, I'm sure if we were to fast forward a couple hundred years from now and someone's listening to this podcast at that point in time, they're going to say, oh, those 21st century Christians, their culture tainted their theology, and we need to fix that. So, and that's again why I say that we can't remove culture from it. It's always impacting it. So it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. Sometimes when you're in the midst of it, you can't see the way that your culture is influencing your views.
Yeah, I will reject my earlier statement from that.
I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to
oh, no, you're good. It's just now understanding it from somebody who knows the field vastly better than I do. Like, oh, okay, what I said was dumb.
Well, maybe there's your science coming into play too, right? I'm going to be objective. I'm going to look at the scientific data here.
Yeah, just be objectifiable. Wait for the information to be presented and then judge your conclusion.
Which is a whole other can of worms that we could open up if science really objective, right?
Well, that's something we could do with philosophy, and something I was dying to get to pick your brain about. Because
do we have time to pick their brain?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, we got time. It's fine.
Because I've had an ethics class with you, and we had some good discussions throughout that and afterwards, but is there, I guess depending on who you are you would answer this differently, but is there an objective morality or an objective truth? Because a lot of people, especially young people like myself, who maybe haven't taken as many classes or just have different views of the world than I do, will say that whatever you believe, because it's in your head and you believe it, it must be true. We had that discussion with, moral relativism and that theory.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, relativism is this view that there is no truth, and that essentially anything can be true for anyone at any time. So, maybe today I say, stealing's wrong, but maybe tomorrow I change my mind and say that stealing's okay.
5-finger discount.
Yeah, exactly, right. And that's a very broad, or very quick view of relativism, and I have a problem with relativism. And,
I do too.
So many of my students are drawn to it, and so I spend a lot of my time in ethics class really trying to show the problems with it. And I think that there are some objective truths. Now, can we know for certain what the objective truths are? Maybe not. I think there are some things that we can... I can say with some confidence that I think that this is an objective truth. But if we want to be moral relativists, then the logical conclusion to that is that you couldn't tell anyone that things like rape, genocide, child pornography, abuse, you couldn't say that those things are wrong, because a relativist would say, well, truth is dependent upon my beliefs, and so maybe I want to say that there's nothing wrong with genocide. And can we under any conditions say that rape is acceptable, that rape is okay, that it's morally good for rape? I have yet to hear a valid argument that says that's okay. But that's the logical consequence of moral relativism. You couldn't say that that's wrong.
Okay. I'm just collecting all this.
And I think where we're beginning to see some of the problems with relativism in our society is that, well, if there is no truth, then we can claim anything. And we're hearing people talk about this post-fact world, right? Like, if there is no truth, then any politician can claim anything. Alternative facts, right. And that's the thing. If relativism is true, then there are really no well, I guess you can look at it two ways. You can say that alternative facts are true, or you can say that there are no alternative facts, that everything simply just is a fact.
Okay.
And do we want to live in a world where everything is true. Like, don't we have to hold some people to standards of truth?
Like Islam and not Islam, the Islamic State and beheading people.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a relativist, you have to say, well, that goes with their worldview. So even though we think it's wrong, it's kind of okay because it goes along with everything that they believe.
Yeah, you couldn't condemn any acts of violence. You would then have to allow the racists to be racist. Lynchings, you would have to say, well, hey, if that's what they believe, that's what they want to do, then I can't step in and interfere. And so, it's not just individual relativism that's a problem, but it's also cultural relativism as well. Like, if we didn't have people standing up for truth, then we would still have slavery in this country. And I know that we've had the civil rights movement and there's still racism, so I'm not trying to discount that, that's not at play. But thankfully, we did have people who stood up against slavery, and that's been abolished. If there was no truth, if there was cultural relativism, then women still wouldn't have the right to vote.
It's true.
And I like bringing that up in class, especially to females who are trying to argue for relativism. Well,
if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be calling on you.
Because relativism would say you can't critique your own culture.
Right.
Because if every culture is right.
Yeah.
And then what happens whenever cultures conflict with one another? Because...
Oh, yeah. Then which one's right?
Exactly. Now, at one point in time, in the ancient world, when some cultures may never interact with each other, and so you might not have a problem.
Right.
But in our globalized world now, people come with so many different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Like, what happens to the American Muslim? Their Islamic background is saying that alcohol is forbidden. You're not supposed to drink it. But their American culture says alcohol is great. They sit down and watch a football game, and like every other commercial is an ad for some type of domestic beer. So then they have this conflict. Well, which culture is right? My American culture, my Muslim culture? There's no way to say which one trumps the other, because a relativist wants to say they're all true.
Right. You're just stuck in this endless war within your own mind.
Well, that's the whole thing with the law of non-contradiction. That there has to be some things that are true and some things that are not true.
Yeah.
Because two contradictory statements cannot be both true at the same time and in the same way. I cannot be both alive and dead at the same time. I'm one or the other.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about that on a physics standpoint. Like, I mean, somebody can't sit here and tell me, like, that's not a solid, that's a liquid. Like, no, it's not a dense liquid. Dense liquids are solids. Like, that wouldn't work. That you can't be right both times there. So I'm just flying through my head thinking of all these different physical standpoints where that just would not work.
Yeah. And I know we're getting off track a little bit, because someone might argue, well, while I believe that there are truths when it comes to the physical world, can't be both alive and dead at the same time, in morality they might try to maintain that morality is different.
Yeah.
And so I could argue that there are no moral truths.
Okay.
But then again, it brings us back to the problem of, well, if that's the case, then I could be a serial killer and no one could tell me that serial killing is wrong.
Right.
We would have the... what's that movie where you have the 24-hour time period where anyone... The Purge, yeah, you would have the Purge all over again, right? Or just imagine rush hour traffic on a Friday afternoon. Well, the stop signs are optional, right? I don't have to follow them. People are already, like, getting into road rage.
Oh my gosh. That would be panic, especially down Route 30. I can just imagine. No traffic signs. Good luck.
So on the very least, we need at least moral truths to have an orderly society.
Yeah.
In order to survive.
Well, that's the thing. Like, just survival alone needs morality into it. If you don't have morality, if you took everybody and just went, nobody has any morals, I'd give the planet a week.
I think you're being generous with that too.
Probably. Just I can't fathom not having any kind of morality at all.
Yeah. Now, I think the big question, though, is that if we agree that morals are necessary, then what morals are necessary is the obvious question that comes out of that. And there's where I think that there is a little more room for open discussion.
Yeah, that's getting way deeper into it.
Yeah, where you're getting into the particulars of, is lying wrong? And, well, maybe it's wrong under some circumstances, but not other circumstances.
Which would be a white lie. Like a little white lie.
Or it might be a big lie that has positive outcomes. Like maybe I'm trying to think of a good example here. Maybe for national security. Okay. I tell a lie to prevent us from going to war, or tell a lie to prevent nuclear holocaust, or something along those lines. So that would be a big lie.
Good point.
But
yeah. Okay. Good point.
Kim Jong-un said he liked your shoes. Well, that's going to prevent. That's going to prevent.
Problem solved. Right. Nukes off.
Or maybe we're telling Kim Jong-un that we like his shoes, so he doesn't attack us.
Yeah, you got a little smudge on there. Click. I'm out of questions. Do you have anything else?
That's a good. I think it's a good. God, I mean, I have so much more.
We've touched on a lot.
Yeah, perhaps we can do this another time.
Sure,
There's one more question I want to get to.
Wait, no, you said you're out of questions.
It doesn't have to be in depth. Just something kind of fun that sparks interest to end the podcast with. What's the purpose of life? Mr. Philosopher.
Here's another 3 hours.
Just briefly.
Briefly, maybe I would say to love one another. I'll be cheesy, but you know what?
I like that.
I don't think that you can go wrong with that one.
Yeah, and hearing it was somebody with your kind of background just give that answer. Yeah. I like that.
Now, am I always good at that? No, I don't want to give the impression that I'm the exemplar of that, because I need to take that advice just as much as everyone else. But
so just to love each other.
Yeah, and who can argue with that, right?
Yeah,
that's going to bring all the religions together.
I can't. I'm supposed to be compassionate and forgiving always. Right. So, yeah, I like that answer. That's cool. Is that what you were expecting, or were you expecting anything?
I wasn't expecting, but I'm not surprised. It actually goes along with your perspective of God. So
yeah, very well.
I think that's a good way to tie everything up and put a little bow on it for this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah,
hope we can do it again
really
sometime.
Appreciate that.
Great.
Yeah,
I would to do that.
Absolutely love to get you on again. We didn't. To my knowledge, I don't think we touched ethics so much, and I was actually thinking about getting a few books on ethics. I've started to collect some philosophy books because of that guy. I do have one more question, real quick.
Hang on, everyone.
We'll get there eventually. If I were to be interested in taking courses in philosophy, what could I look forward to learning? What kind of courses would I take?
I would probably start off with a typical introduction to philosophy class.
Okay.
Because the way I teach it, the way a lot of people teach it, is I compare it to a buffet. That we're going to give you a small sampling of these different ways of thinking, these different topics. So we're going to touch on anything from ethics to metaphysics, a little bit of probably logic thrown in there, epistemology, like knowledge, like how do we know what is truth, those types of things. And so then once you kind of get a taste for everything, then you can develop a palate for what you are drawn to. Or it's kind of like a flight of beer, right? You try all these different varieties, and you find out what you like.
Yeah.
And then after getting that like 2 ounce taste of it, then you're like, all right, I'm going to take a full pint of that one, and I want a full pint of this one over here. So, I mean, that's the obvious place to start.
Yeah,
I think.
Sounds good to me, because now after this conversation, I'm really considering it now.
Awesome.
Yeah,
we're going to turn you into a philosopher.
Yes.
You can give up that science stuff.
Yeah, good luck. That's reconstructing my whole life. All right. Well, I'm all out of questions.
Yep.
You're
I
good?
think we're good.
All right.
Fantastic.
Thank you again for being here. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. It was wonderful conversation. And we'll see everybody in the next episode.
Sounds good to me. Thanks everyone for watching or listening, or however you're receiving this information.
See you guys.
Good.